Good morning, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus, and we're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us in our webinar Wednesday series. And in 2022, we are covering the FAR supplements. As most of our webinars are, it's a complimentary series, and these are held on Wednesdays at 12 o'clock. A quick blurb about us. We're based in downtown DC and provide professional services for product, service, and software companies that are selling to the federal government. Some of the services that we provide are market analysis reports, GSA schedule assistance, and other a la carte services. You can find more about us on our website under the About Us section. A little bit about our webinars and the newsletter that lets you know about the webinars is that we now reach over 23,000 opt-in subscriber, most of which are federal contractors. We do have opportunities for any companies that want to advertise. And as of last week, we hit 500 webinars. Those are all complimentary. They're on our YouTube channel. If you're having trouble finding anything on our YouTube channel, go over to our website, and those are all sorted by category. If you just navigate to the website tab, or I'm sorry, webinar tab, various topics on government contracting are in that drop down. We also do have sponsorship opportunities in our webinar series. Okay, so for this series in 2022, as we did in 2021 and 2020, the webinars are all complimentary, they're recorded. As mentioned, you can find them on the YouTube channel and also on our website. The PowerPoints are on slideshare.net, and again, everything is available for a complimentary download. So we are covering the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Department procurement rules, regulations, nuances for each of the departments and agencies. Our speakers are subject matter experts, government contracts attorneys, and I think we have some accountants in there as well. This is the schedule for the year, so it takes us through August, and that's the VA is the last agency that we're going to cover. So we've already covered FAR, and then last week was cost accounting standards. This week is DOD, next week DPGI. You can see the full schedule there. Again, those are Wednesdays at 12 o'clock. And then on the corresponding Friday, we're going to cover a Playbook webinar, and those are really doing business with that particular department or agency. So the first 2 weeks are really not applicable. This Friday, we're doing business with DOD. Next week, because on Wednesday, we're covering DPGI, there's not a corresponding agency or department, but we'll pick it up the following Friday, which will be doing business with the Army. That means on Wednesday of that week, we're covering the FAR supplement on the Army. Hopefully that makes sense. You can also find the schedule on our website under the Playbook tab or the supplement tab. Okay, I want to thank our sponsor, the Virginia PTAC. They're the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. They work with organizations who are just starting out and have an interest in contracting with the government. They offer one-on-one counseling, training sessions. I think they're doing some in person. So they've got some hybrid classes as well as some mentoring, training, matchmaking, and other events. I'd suggest that you just go onto their website, look at their calendar, or reach out to them directly via phone or email. Contact information is here at the bottom of your screen. Okay, let's start digging in here. So as I mentioned today, we are covering the FAR Department supplement on DFARS, defense, and our speaker is Jody Reed. She has graciously shared her time and expertise with us today and over the years. So Jody, welcome. I'm going to put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
I am ready for my next slide. So just to kind of put things in perspective, I am an attorney at a small 8-person law firm. We do government contracts from A to Z. Plus, we have a couple of partners who are very heavily involved in mergers and acquisitions. We basically can cover anything that happens within the DOD, within really government contracting. We have expertise in that area. So today, what we're going to do is we're not going to delve very deeply into anything under DFARS. There was all of last year was spent. All of last year. Each of the section of the DFARS was reviewed, and so if there's a particular section you have more interest in, I do strongly I suggest that you go back and take a look at that section from last year's presentations. The DFARS basically came out at the same time as the FAR came out, which was in 1984. Prior to that, you had the Armed Services Procurement Regulation, and that really formed the basis of most of the FAR. At the time, the FAR was supposed to replace the ASPR, but even at that point, they did recognize that there were some things that needed to be handled under the DOD that was not applicable to other agencies. As time has passed, the things that are dealt with differently has greatly expanded. When the DFARS originally came out, when the FAR book was probably, I'm going to call it the baby FAR, which is the one that is the bound book that's in a slightly smaller versus what used to be the loose leaf FAR. And if you were to put this next to each other, the FAR was about 1.5 inches, and that stayed about the same over the years. And the DFARS was probably about 1/3 the size of that. As time has passed, and as Congress has continually tweaked all the different things that they do with the DOD that doesn't apply to other agencies across the board, the DFARS is now about 1/3 bigger than the FAR, and a lot of more stuff is handled differently in the FAR. There's two ways that the DFARS works, and really it's almost all the agencies. There's kind of two ways the way that works. One is that it completely replaces the FAR clause, and we'll talk about some of the clauses that do that, or some of the regulations that do that. And another one is simply supplements the FAR. So, for example, you have the simplified acquisition threshold is set forth in FAR, and everything about it is the same, except that the threshold is actually higher in the DFARS. Another area where you see this is the clauses for data. They leave in the FAR clause for that's based on the Bayh-Dole Act, which is for patents, but then everything else in the DFARS gets replaced by the language of the DFARS. Next slide. Jennifer, thank you. So the organization is very straightforward. So for every FAR part, there is a corresponding DFARS part. And if there's something that the DFARS is not changing from the FAR, what they'll do is you'll still see the FAR part there, but what happens is they just say, I think they say not used or unused, something like that. The numbers are the same, except DFARS sections start with a 2. And for each of the other agencies, they all kind of are set up the same way. They'll just change what the first number is. Thus, for example, IP is handled under FAR Part 27 and DFARS 227. Again, some FAR parts are heavily revised, others are barely mentioned. Next slide. So all the DFARS parts are also at the website, www.acquisition.gov/DFARS, or you can just go into acquisition.gov and click on where it talks about regulations and click on DFARS. There are a number of new definitions that are specific to DOD. There are a few definitions that are slightly different than what's in there under the FAR. So some examples is going to be how major defense acquisition program is defined, a lot of things around the cyber issues, and then some other different issues related to different parts. Next slide. There's also another document that goes kind of along with the DFARS, and it's called the Procedures, Guidance, and Information. And basically, it's a companion resource to the DFARS. Then I'm quoting this here from the actual DFARS, which is, it contains mandatory, and this is an important word, internal DOD procedures. And there's actually case law out there where the government has tried to apply the PGI against contractors, and the courts have been pretty straightforward on this one, that that's an internal procedure and it does not have the full force and effect of law. That said, I strongly recommend if the DFAR references something in a PGI that you definitely go take a look at that PGI, because there is also still a argument that if the regulation says follow the procedures at blank, 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 that now may come in and be considered to be the full force and effect of law. Again, it's numbered the same basically as the FAR clauses and DFAR clauses. The only difference is going to be it's going to be preceded by the letters PGI, and you have it available here at the acquisition.osd website. Again, I want to point out these are non-mandatory DOD procedures, and they're to be used at the discretion of the contracting officer. And you know the difference between something that is a mandatory versus mandatory is one will say follow the procedures at, and the other one say the contracting officer may use. And that's really where you need to make sure that you understand the difference there. Next slide. So we're going to go through each of the parts, and you're going to see comments on each of the parts as to how it goes with how it impacts in its relationship to the FAR. So the first one is Part 203, improper business practices and personal conflicts of interest. And that's one of the areas that the DFARS supplements the requirements of the FAR, but does not replace. Same thing as Part 204. And think about this. So there are just some things that the DFARS definitely deals with in a lot more extensively than the FAR. So that section here includes some discussion and regulatory language regarding cybersecurity, generally security, the NIST, referencing the NISPON, which is the document that handles anything that is classified. The contract reporting, and again, this is a lot of stuff that applies mostly to the government. SAM, uniform contract, and then anti-terrorist changing. And it just never ceases to amaze me how many contracts I see where they're buying a part that has absolutely nothing to do with anything, and yet they still include in there the clauses for anti-terrorism training. Acquisition planning is at Part 207, and that part describes how DOD is supposed to do its acquisition planning. Now, if you're watching here, you're saying, well, you went 203, 204, 207. It's because either the parts in the middle there were not used, or they just really didn't have anything significant to say, so I just kind of skipped them. And that's going to happen also. One of the big things with acquisition planning you have to keep in mind is that there are some DOD memos that tell contracting officers what they're supposed to do. It is not, again, full force and effective law. However, it behooves any organization that thinks that that stuff is going to be handled differently. And where you see this a lot is in the protest arena, where they are relying upon a particular DFAR clause, and they then say, no, that there's also this memo that they're working on. And I will tell you, both the plaintiff and the government frequently use the memos either to their benefit or to their detriment. Next slide. 209 is contractor qualifications. And again, this is a supplemental part, but the big piece that you need to take home from this one is this part introduces the concept of the lead system integrator. And if you see something, there's a lot of restrictions on what a lead system integrator may do. And a lot of them deal with the concepts of conflict of interest and things like that. So that's DFARS. They don't generally have any language in the FAR relating to that. And you're going to see the term later in another FAR part. Part 212, acquisition of commercial items. This section actually both supplements and replaces some relevant FAR sections. One of the things is the definition of commercial is different between FAR and DFARS. And the difference is that commercial under the DFARS expressly does not include sales to foreign governments. However, the FAR definition does include sales to foreign government. So that's always been a little bit of a sticky wicket when we're talking about commercial items. And what results of this is you have a commercial item and you're selling it under the FAR. You clearly can sell it as a commercial item, but then as soon as it becomes under the DFARS, if you're selling to that to a government agency under the FAR, when it starts coming out of the DFARS, they would not count that actually as part of your commercial item sales. Next slide. Part 213, I mentioned it earlier. All the DOD thresholds are much higher than they are under the FAR. On Part 215, you get the concept of weighted guidelines, which is used to determine profit, and you do not have that similar language in the FAR. Part 218, emergency acquisitions. Here, this is something that they don't really talk very much about in the FAR itself. However, a lot of the expenses and especially at the initiation of the recent Gulf and Afghani wars, was done under this emergency acquisitions part of the DFARS. However, as time went on, they did actually go away from using this as a justification. Next slide. Part 223, as you can well imagine, this is probably a little bit of a supplement, and that's mostly because you now have to deal with the handling of weapons, ammunition, and toxic and hazardous substances. So it's a much more extensive clause or set of regulations, because it does have to deal with a lot more stuff. So and you'll see this also in some of like the energy ones. They would also have a lot more supplementing the FAR in the environmental area. Part 225, foreign acquisition. Again, you have a lot of guidance here that is just not in the FAR. Obviously, Buy American Trade Agreements Act is included in the FAR, but contingency operations and administration, instructions to the government on how they evaluate foreign offers, a list of prohibited sources or countries, and all of that is considered part of the FAR. As I mentioned earlier, Part 227 deals with patents, data, and copyrights, and with the exception of the application of the Bayh-Dole Act, the entire section is revised from the FAR, and the language expressly states that it replaces the FAR language. One of the other things that's very distinct about under the DOD is under the FAR, you have limited rights and unlimited rights. Whereas when we start talking about the DOD, you have limited rights, government purpose rights, and then you have unlimited rights. There's also special rights in both of those. But it's a complete replacement, and if you're working on DOD and you're looking at the FAR to decide on how you're marking your stuff, you're doing yourself a disservice, because the DFARS has definitely got more stringent activity in it. And also, as I indicated earlier, the DFARS does not recognize commercial products quite as widely as the FAR. Next slide. Bonds and insurance, Part 228. You have this concept of Defense Base Act insurance. And basically what happens is anytime a company gets a contract to send employees, especially like to Iraq or to Afghanistan, they had to buy extra insurance for the employees. It's called DBA insurance, and you just basically had to buy more insurance. Presumably, if they were to go to someplace that wasn't in a war zone, they would not have to have that level of insurance. Part 230 is the CAS program requirements, cost accounting standards. There is a fairly significant paragraph in the regulation that provides for a waiver of CAS, and there's some certain conditions that have to be met in order for it to get the waiver. Part 231, contract cost principles and procedures. This is one of these areas where there is a supplement to what is in the FAR, and the list of what additional requirements they're going to have is listed in 231.2. Then you come up, you have Part 233, protest, disputes, and appeals. for anything that's dealing with DOD, it goes to the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. Everybody else goes to the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals. In addition, the protest requirements are different for DOD and the task area protest area. It's harder to protest a task under DOD than it is to protest under the general FAR. Next slide. Well, I guess I copied something twice. 234. No, go up. It's just 233 I copied twice apparently. 234 is major systems acquisition. While there is discussion of this under FAR Part 34, this is completely replaced with a whole bunch of new and different requirements if there's major system acquisitions. There's also a PGI that is related to PGI that is related to major system acquisitions that provides a lot more instruction to the government on what they need to do in order to be compliant with major systems acquisitions. Part 235, research and development contracting. Again, here you have some new requirements dealing with federally funded research and development centers. There's also a lot more looking at what kinds of things research and development can be and so forth like that. Next slide. Service contracting. So they've added some requirements and new items for service contractors. For example, for military flight simulators or acquisition requirements for a roadmap tool, services for quasi-military armed forces, to name a few. So you have a DFARS language in there that basically has one sentence that says you have to look at the PGI for the acquisition of services. And the PGI is probably about 20 or 30 pages long. Acquisition of information services, Part 239. It's got some extensive guidance and regulation regarding the purchasing of IT. One of the things that you see a lot in is say for example, they're going to use a GSA schedule to buy something. They will adopt part of the schedule, and then they will impose all these additional requirements, even though the schedule price is what they're using on. And there's been some pushback occasionally saying, you know, you've added a whole bunch of stuff that we have to do, but you don't want to pay for it. And quite frankly, they don't want to pay for it. So there's been some pushback on that. 242 is contract administration, and that describes the regulation that a contractor must abide by. And it's really more going along the lines of where the Defense Contract Management Agency comes in, as well as DCAA, the contract audit, the Defense Contract Audit Agency. And both of these two organizations do not exist in the non-DOD world. And up until a couple of years ago, the other agencies would basically fund and borrow time from both DCMA and DCAA. But as DCAA got more and more backed up, Congress came in and said, nope, DCAA says defense, you're not to go in and work anything else. It was never quite the same issue with DCMA. Next slide. Subcontracting policies and procedures. So if a company has a contractor's purchasing review and they pass it, and DCMA performs the review, then they do not have to go to the government and ask permission to buy stuff. If they don't pass it, then they have to go to the government to request permission. Now, in the industry, there's always been a question that if you have something in your proposal and they grant you the proposal, does that mean they have approved of your purchase or your subcontract? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is maybe. And it's been treated differently in different agencies, and even within different agencies in the DOD. And I will tell you the biggest problem when they have to make the approval process is, quite frankly, they just don't do what they need to do to make to do the approvals. And so you'll submit something, and you might not see an answer for 3 to 6 months, which in some cases is pretty much kills what the contractor is supposed to do. Although what will happen then is they have an argument for excusable delay, but the program offices generally don't like to buy into that, and they will pressure the contracting officer to go ahead and approve of the subcontract. Part 245, government property. The DOD, they're the ones that have the government property. And just the sheer size of it means that they probably are handling more government property than any other agency. And the rules and the regulations regarding that government property are much more extensively described in the DFARS sections than they are in the FAR. Quality assurance, the QA requirements are much more specified and stringent. Again, think about it, because what the agencies buy is not stuff that is going to probably kill people. And you want to have a QA for, say, Joint Strike Fighter. You're going to want to make sure that that thing not only flies, but it flies today and 2 years, 10 years from now as well. Next slide. Part 250, extraordinary contract actions. This is one that you see rarely used, but what they do have in there is the delegations and limitations of authority for the use of this part, and it's not a very low delegation, quite frankly. And they also have to including the special procedures for handling unusually hazardous or nuclear risks and indemnification costs for those risks. So if you're a company that is doing high risk stuff, you probably want to make sure that that stuff is not going to be considered their property. And finally, Part 252, this is where they take all these DFAR parts and get applied as clauses in contracts. And anybody who looks at a typical subcontract will very quickly see that the list of FAR clauses and the list of DFARS clauses, it's a toss-up these days, which list is longer. So where's the heads up on this one? I find, and I see this all the time, I find that both from the government side of things and the prime contractor side of things, that I'm going to call it what it is. People are just lazy. So they put everything in there, and they'll put in both the FAR clause and the DFAR clause. And if you don't look at it really closely, most of the time you don't even notice that they do have both clauses in there. And the question becomes which clause is going to apply. Now, my gut says it's going to be the DFAR clause. But in certain circumstances, I know cases have been turned down and denied because one organization was relying on one clause and the other organization was relying on the other clause, and they basically say that they won't take the case because it's not a they don't want to have to decide which one is going to be the applicable clause. And this also happens a lot when you get in the DOD, GSA buys for DOD. So the GSA contract has all the clauses. And there's been a long argument for some time that if you have a DOD contractor using the GSA to buy something, are they going to have to go to the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, or are they going to have to go to the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals? And interestingly enough, I'm not aware of a decision that has come out from the Federal Circuit saying it very clearly. But one of the things we do know that, for example, a termination for default under GSA must be issued by the GSA contracting officer and not the DOD contracting officer. So there is an argument that if you have a dispute on your contract, that it's not the DOD stuff that would apply. It is the GSA language, and the GSA courts would be the one looking at it. Next slide. So that's pretty much the 20,000-foot description of the DFARS. You have my contact information here. Like I said, we are a small law firm. We work with a broad range of companies, providing a broad range of expertise in that work. And on that note, I'll turn it back to Jennifer.
Jody, thank you so much for the great presentation, excellent content. If anyone's looking for a more detailed look at any of the parts that Jody covered on our website, we do have a section for the FAR and the DFARS, and we've covered each of those parts, so you can drill down and get the recording to those, as well as the PowerPoint slides. If you've got any questions about today's presentation, please contact Jody. You've got her email and phone number here. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. On Friday, we're kicking off our first Playbook series, which will be doing business with DOD. We do have our government speaker confirmed. We'll be talking about business opportunities, strategies, merger and acquisition activities happening within the DOD contracting base. And I'm trying to think, what else are we covering? I think that should do it. So you can sign up for that on our website, and today's recording should be available hopefully by tomorrow morning. We'll have that on our YouTube channel as well as our website. And if you've registered for today's program, you'll get an email with links to everything. So thanks again, Jody. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you guys all next week and Friday.
And I think I can just say goodbye.